I will start by saying that Iran is among the few countries in the world that openly and unequivocally calls for the elimination of Israel, and where support of Zionism is a crime punishable by death in its penal code. Now, Iran, as Professor Nelson said, denies that it is anti-Semitic like other anti-Semites. It is claimed that it distinguishes between Zionism, which describes a racist, violent movement and an offshoot of Western imperialism, and Judaism as a religion which Islam recognizes. But in fact, Iran's Islamic discourse is suffused with explicit anti-Semitism. If we go to discuss the difference between traditional anti-Judaism and modern anti-Semitism, Iran is a good example because Iran was always less tolerant toward Jews and toward other minorities than Sunni Islam. Shi'i doctrine regards Jews as ritually unclean, which means, for instance, if a Jew touches food, mostly it has to be cleansed from this Jewish impurity. There were forced conversions of Jews in 17th century Iran, about a third of the Jewish community. In 1839, the entire Jewish community of Mashhad was forced to convert to Islam, but they remained crypto-Jews for 100 years. This was traditional anti-Semitism against Judaism as a religion. What distinguishes modern anti-Semitism from this traditional anti-Judaism is the addition of conspiracy theories, demonization of the Jews, and I would say the genocidal element. Now, the person who I would say most responsible for this shift to modern anti-Semitism is Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran, the founder of the Islamic Republic of Iran, its chief ideologue. And Khomeini was a rabid anti-Semite all his life. In his most important ideological tract, The Rule of the Jewish, published in 1970, already on page 1, he states that Islam was afflicted by the Jews from its inception, because the Jews had conspired against the Prophet and they used various ploys against him to undermine his mission. And then 4 pages later, Khomeini moves to the modern period, and he says that in the modern period, Islam has been under attack from an unholy alliance of the West, the Jews, and Westernized Iranians who conspire against Islam, because the Jews and the West understand that Islam is the most important barrier to their ambitions to dominate the world, and also they want to prevent Islam from fulfilling its historical mission to spread all over the world. For Khomeini, Zionism is simply the practical implementation of Judaism. And by the way, he adds that had the Muslims not abandoned Islam, then a bunch of wretched Jews would not have been able to take over Palestine from its legitimate inhabitants. And he added that it is a religious duty incumbent upon all Muslims to eliminate Israel. Of course, his ideas became Iran's official ideology after the 1979 revolution. And if you look at his successor, the current leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, for him, Zionism is a satanic conspiracy invented by the West to subjugate the Muslims. Now, while he denies that he's an anti-Semite, occasionally in his speeches, he uses anti-Semitic tropes. Now, what are the manifestations of anti-Semitism today in Iran? One is, again, it's a modern phenomenon. Even though the Islamic Republic hates the West and hates Western culture, it borrows freely from Western anti-Semitism. Most prominent manifestations is the official publication of the most notorious anti-Semitic document, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the supposed Jewish conspiracy to take over the world. The blood libel, you have Iranian academics explaining on TV how the Jewish doctors use blood for ritual purposes. Now, the reason you haven't heard about it in the news is because the Jews dominate the media, and this is why the news about these crimes have been hidden. You can also see, by the way, use of anti-Semitic tropes against Israel, including the story that Israeli doctors harvest organs of Palestinian children to transplant in Israeli injured soldiers or sell them in the, say, world market. Again, a modern use of the blood libel. Very important, which I will discuss later, is the denial of justification of the Holocaust, and then depicting the Jews as enemies of Shia Islam. Now, again, just to show you, this is anti-Semitism and not anti-Zionism. These are two caricatures published in Iran, which I think are very speak for themselves. This is a caricature about, by the way, about the Holocaust. I mean, the Iran's government organized exhibition of caricatures about the Holocaust. The caricature that won first place is this one on the left, the emblem of the gate of Auschwitz. But of course, Al-Aqsa Mosque is the modern Auschwitz guarded by Israelis. Again, this is the modern Jew who looks in the mirror and he sees Hitler. Look, by the way, if you look at this caricature of the Jew, typical European anti-Semitic description of the Jews, you can also see it is of the phenomenon of what I call Judaizing the enemy. You want to slander someone, you describe your enemy as Jewish. For instance, the claim that the founder of the anti-Shia Wahhabi movement was in fact of Jewish descent. And Wahhabism was a Jewish ploy to split the Muslims. And this again, in Iran caricature, which I think is self-evident, no need to explain how, again, Judaism produced Wahhabism. And again, you look at the picture of the depiction of the Jew, typical European anti-Semitic trope. Another example is the description of the Saudi royal family as, in fact, of being Jews or of being of Jewish descent. Not only being of Jewish descent, but in fact they are descendants of the Jewish tribe of Banu Kainuka, who had fought against the Prophet Muhammad, and this is why the Saudi royal family had sold Palestine to the Jews. Now, a very important manifestation of Iranian anti-Semitism disguised as anti-Zionism is Holocaust denial and Holocaust justification. Now, Iran is the only state in the world whose most senior officials, including Supreme Leader Khamenei and former Presidents Rafsanjani and Ahmadinejad, had denied the Holocaust and at times justified Nazi actions against the Jews. Now, Iran was the only country in the world to vote against the UN resolution to declare January 27th as the International Memorial Day for the Holocaust. And as I mentioned, Iran Foreign Ministry organized competitions of caricatures about the Holocaust or related to the Holocaust. Now, it is not just Ahmadinejad who denied the Holocaust, but Iran's Supreme Leader Khamenei, for instance, he established the contours of denial when he maintained that it was the Zionist exaggerated Nazi crimes against the European Jews in order to solicit international support for the establishment of the Zionist entity in 1948. He accused the Zionists of using this myth in order to fight anti-Zionism, which was rife all over Europe. And Zionism invented in order to make the Jews look oppressed so they could achieve their murderous goals in other parts of the world. He also, by the way, blames the US for inventing the Zionist myth as a means of not only to expand American power, but also to obliterate or downplay American crimes in the world, in the Second World War, that mostly use of nuclear weapons against Japan. Now, there's another element of Holocaust denial, Holocaust denial in Iran, as you can say, is by making false comparisons. For instance, former President Rafsanjani, a pragmatist, a moderate in Iran, denounced Israel as much worse than Hitler. And he stated that the Zionists killed more than 1 million Palestinians, an action which is much worse than what Hitler had done in Second World War to the Jews. Hitler killed at the most 200,000 people. Now, he admitted that Hitler committed injustice against the Jews and other groups. And yes, but he also persecuted Muslims, Christians, atheists, Marxists. But again, he killed only 200,000 Jews at the most. And the figure of 6 million Jews is therefore a propaganda myth invented by the Zionists. Now, why is Iran so adamant about the Holocaust? And the Iranians say it openly. Because Israel lacks any moral historical justification for its existence, it was established, it attained support at the time based on the lie of the Holocaust. Therefore, if we refute the Holocaust, we will demolish the entire moral historical foundation of Israel. You can also add there's another element that it is very difficult to accept the victimhood or the suffering of your enemy. And maybe if there was a Holocaust, then maybe some of the claims of the Jews that they were an oppressed nation and maybe they deserve statehood could be justified. Therefore, we have to deny the Holocaust. But Iran does not only deny the Holocaust. Iran officials also justify Hitler's moves against the Jews. Of course, there was no Holocaust, but what he did to the Jews was justified. And here, Rafsanjani, the moderate, explains that Hitler simply wanted to liberate free Europe from the evils of Zionism. And it was justified because the Zionists constituted a strong political party in Europe and they caused much disorder in Europe. And because the Zionists had lots of property and controlled empire of propaganda, they made European governments helpless. And accordingly, Hitler and the German Nazis simply wanted to expel the Zionists from Europe. And the result of their policy against the Jews was the calamity that fell upon the Muslims in Palestine. In other words, Hitler was right in persecuting Zionists. There was no Holocaust, but it was not 6 million. But the real victims are the Palestinians and not the Jews. Now, typical of anti-Semites all over the world, the UN Holocaust anti-Holocaust denial discourse contains internal contradictions. Again, to give another example, former Parliament Speaker Kerubi, another so-called moderate, on the one hand denied the Holocaust and stated that Hitler massacred or Hitler's massacre of the innocent Jews was a Zionist conspiracy. And in fact, the Zionists helped Hitler kill the Jews. So there was no Holocaust, but the Zionists actually are those who are guilty of the Holocaust. Now, another very important point of modern anti-Semitism, which has, I would say, practical ramifications, is the description of the Jews as the most corrupt nation in the world. And again, according to Ayatollah, later Ayatollah Muhammad Taqi Misbah Yazdi, let's say the great eminence of the hardliners in Iran, the majority of the centers of corruption in the world belong to the Jews and Zionists, and the Jews are the most corrupt nation in the world. You cannot find such corruption in any other no such tribe as corrupt as the Jews elsewhere. Now, why is it so important? Because corruption is one of the most worst crimes in Islamic law. Corruption on earth is an offense in the Iranian penal code that carries the death sentence. Therefore, if you describe the Jews as a corrupt nation, I would say you pave the way for the moral justification of eliminating the Jews. Now, another interesting phenomenon, more modern phenomenon, is to describe the Jews historically as the enemies of Shia Islam. The Jews were responsible for the worst tragic event that happened in Islam when Ali, the son-in-law and cousin of the Prophet Muhammad, was robbed from his right in succession of the Prophet. It was the Jewish organization in Medina that dominated events and led to the usurpation of the leadership from Ali. And this was the event that diverted Islam from its right path. All the tragedies that had befallen upon Islam from that day on, tragedies that had befallen Islam go back to this day, and they are the results of this Jewish conspiracy. One major reason why the Jews are described as enemies of Shiism is to depict Shiism as the complete opposite of Judaism. Sunni Islam has been contaminated by the Jews. Sunni Islam, they call it Islam virusi, that is Islam inflicted by viruses, because it's also similar to Judaism. because Shia Islam is the complete opposite of Judaism. The Jews target Shia Islam and therefore made the Shias their victims. Now, the Jews are also responsible for the death of all Shia imams, whereas in the past they were the corrupt caliphs were accused, and worst, the Jews were responsible for the death of Imam Hussein in the tragic Battle of Karbala. Again, the battle that defines Shiism, defines Shi'i worldview as the battle between the righteous few and the evil many, where injustice prevailed over justice. It was the hand of the Jews who was responsible. The person who killed uh, um, Imam Hussein, the caliph, was in fact of Jewish descent. Let me move to another element. Of course, Baha'ism is again Jewish conspiracy against Islam, and the Jews were also responsible for the modern tragedies that befallen Iran. It was the Rothschild who was responsible for the famine that took place in Iran in 1919, which supposedly caused the death of 2 million Iranians. Why? Because Rothschild knew that Iran would be the number one enemy of Zionism. He wanted to destroy Iran, and therefore he was responsible for the famine, and 2 million Iranians paid with their lives for what Rothschild, the pro-Zionist Jew, committed. Jewish bankers also installed Reza Shah in power. And finally, Jews were responsible for now not only enemies of Shiism, but enemies of Iran. Jews were responsible for the first genocide that took place, or the first Iranian Holocaust in the story of Esther. Supposedly, again, the Jewish organization dominated Iran. They wanted to subjugate the Iranians, and they carried out this genocide. The Jews claim they killed only 70,000 people, but reliable sources show that Jews killed more than 500,000 Iranians. So again, Jews were responsible for the tragedy of Iran. Now, let me conclude by one element. Shiism, modern Iran has adopted a Sunni tradition which ties the Jews to the age of Apocalypse. There is a Sunni tradition attributed to the Prophet Muhammad that the day of judgment will not come until that day when the Muslims will fight the Jews and kill them all. On that day, the Jews will hide behind trees and rocks, but then God will open the mouth of every tree and every rock, and they will say, O Muslim, O slave of God, there's a Jew behind me, come and kill him. This was a Sunni tradition. In recent years, we see Iran adopting this Sunni tradition. In other words, Iran now links the redemption of the world with the elimination of the Jews. And I will stop here.